All right, and the next speaker is going to address physical activity interventions and what's known about approaches that are effective in that space, and that's Marcas Bamman.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks, Wendy, for asking me to come chat with you. I want to, I have a couple of confessions and then a couple of statements before I get rolling here. You've heard a lot about exercise and physical activity, and you've heard a lot about diet. What I'm hoping to convey to this group in a way that hopefully everybody can appreciate it is that there is a substantial knowledge base, both known and unknown, in what I call molecular exercise biology, which can drive a lot of what we hope to accomplish in clinical trials. So, one confession, I'm a molecular exercise biologist and I direct a National Resource Center for Clinical Trials, so figure that out. We want to help foster trials that we think not only test the primary outcome that has high clinical relevance, but we also hope to foster trials that enable us to explore and dig deep into stem cell biology and any other relevant mechanisms that can help guide those outcomes. So that's the first confession. I wanted to comment, I was struck a little bit this morning by Mr. Harrison's comments and then a couple of the questions from the audience as well. Those of us in here who are scientists are data-driven. That's what we do. But there is a point, I think, of diminishing return. And I'm referring to this idea that how much data are enough before this actually becomes something that patients can benefit from. We do Parkinson's disease research, and I get the exact same thing from the Parkinson's community. How many exercise trials do you have to do before this becomes standard practice, right? Part of what we are exposed to as frontline therapy. And I'm sort of getting the same vibe here that, there's a lot we know. Yeah, maybe we don't have every single intent to treat trial buttoned up with every T cross, but there's a lot we know. And, you have to figure out that balance. At what point is it almost criminal to withhold this important information from people who could benefit? So that's my bully pulpit moment. And the other thing I wanted to say real quickly before I jump into slide, exercise-related health benefits, weight management is one of them, absolutely important. In the context of cancer, you could identify a number of cancers that have an increased risk associated with body weight, no doubt about it, breast cancer, colon cancer, and so forth. But I hope to convey to you in the next few minutes that there are myriad benefits of exercise well beyond weight control. The studies that we do in disease populations, one of which is head and neck cancer, but most of what we do is not in cancer. Weight control is the furthest thing from my mind. We're focusing on disease-specific processes and whether or not we're having an impact on those. If weight control is one of those, then that's a key variable. But I just want to point that out. So we don't know all the molecular mechanisms. We hope to sort that out, and I know many of you in this room are hoping to achieve that as well in your specific discipline. The other thing I think is important for all of us to recognize is exercise is like any other therapy from the standpoint that there are really, really robust responders to your treatment, and there are those folks who don't quite get the same response. And so this concept of response heterogeneity, we've known this for years. If you look at the literature on antihypertensive drugs or any other form of medical treatment, medication prescriptions and regimes are being changed all the time within the individual to try to figure out what works best, right? Exercise is much the same. We've got to figure out what works best. And I appreciate the comment earlier about precision medicine, because I think exercise truly is a form of precision medicine, or should be. So, now I have to figure out how to advance. Here we go. All right, so having said all of that, does this work? We're using mouse. Oh, on this one. Sorry, good. Okay, there are my disclosures. There is no money in exercise. You've heard a lot of these concepts, and so I didn't know exactly who I was going to speak to, so I'm not going to bore you by reading this slide, but I do think a couple of important concepts have emerged for me here that maybe those of you in the audience who don't do this every day would benefit from distinguishing. And in my mind, exercise and physical activity need to be distinguished. We muddle these a lot. The entire field muddles these a lot. NIH muddles these a lot. Physical activity is anything you do above seated rest. And we should all be as active as we can possibly be. And every participant in every study, we need to encourage activity and measure it and do the best we can to quantify it. But exercise is something different. This is prescriptive. This is regimented. It has a goal in mind, which is an improvement in fitness. Being more physically active is great, but it doesn't necessarily always translate into an improvement in fitness. And so I want to distinguish those because some of the health outcomes of exercise training are intensity and volume dependent and are driven by whether or not fitness goes up. So there's caloric expenditure associated with activity, which is great, but there's an intensity dependence in some of these outcomes that are critical. So I just want to point that out. I won't bore you with the rest of that. All right, so this is my schematic, and this is where every exercise trial we ever do, we start right here. What are we going to study? So this is published in a review. Happy to share that with anybody who's interested, but this is critical because the population matters, comorbidities matter, what they do outside of the supervised trial, those things matter. Everything on this board, you can start to dissect and tease apart why some individuals respond really, really well with whatever your outcome might be, and why some don't respond quite as well. And then work yourself backwards. We do a lot of studies where we look at response heterogeneity and work our way backwards to try to uncover these phenotypes. Why do some people do really well, some don't? And that, you can do this at the level of what are they doing outside of your trial, and you can do it at the level of what are their stem cells doing, what is their genotype, can we identify SNPs? I mean, it's everything in between. So you've heard a lot about resistance and endurance exercise training. I don't want to bore you with this, but I just wanted to make sure everybody in the room just really quickly understands what we're talking about, because when we get into these trials, these are entirely different both in practical terms in implementation, but also in expected outcomes. So endurance training, and these are the whoops, go back. These are the current guidelines. They're actually being revised right now. There will be a 2018 HHS update, but from the 08 guidelines, that's what they are for endurance, and that's what they are for resistance. The resistance training guidelines in the HHS report are not very specific, but essentially it's twice a week per muscle group. And so if we think about when do we apply that? Well, you just heard about, age-related muscle atrophy and cancer cachexia and times when it's really, really important to think about muscle atrophy. But there's other times when, you really need to be thinking about cardiorespiratory fitness. So I'm not going to read this to you, but I put it up. This is a very dichotomous view of what happens to the cardiorespiratory system within muscle itself. You can basically look down this list for endurance training and look down this list for strength training and find a lot of things that are happening differentially. And so it's really important. Are you doing combined training? Are you doing each of these individually? What's the goal? Is the goal to have an impact on certain components of muscle? And if so, what's the best mode of exercise to accomplish that? You can carry this forward into other organ systems as well. So if you look at metabolic parameters, what do each of the modes of exercise do, body composition, and so forth. So that's a little bit of a backdrop before I jump in here to really what I wanted to talk about, which is the bulk of the data, irrespective of disease that's being studied, the bulk of the data for health benefits of exercise training are in the context of endurance training. So the data are emerging on resistance training. I do a lot of that in my own work because I study a lot of populations that suffer muscle atrophy. So we have this whole model of muscle regrowth and restoration of muscle function. But in the context of endurance training, which is where most of the public health data are driven, VO2 max is the key, so cardiorespiratory fitness. I don't have to teach this group how you achieve it, but it's been going on for a long, long time. We've been testing VO2 max over 100 years. So really quickly, you don't I probably could skip some of these, but I think a couple of them are important. So sedentary living or sedentary activity, we've heard a lot about trying to increase activity, but in terms of the direct impact of having low activity, these numbers are quite striking to me. So 800,000 people, whoops, I keep doing that. 800,000 people, and what we're talking about is a twofold increased relative risk of having diabetes, 2.5-fold increased relative risk of a cardiovascular event for those that essentially occupy a chair from morning to night. And, you know, a 1.5-fold elevation in all-cause mortality as a hazard ratio. These are really important numbers, I think. So we can talk about evolution, and there's another picture you'll see soon, but this is essentially where we have come. Frank Booth and one of his postdocs and some other colleagues basically mapped out years ago everything they could identify in the literature, whether it was from a human model or an animal model, of organ systems and cellular processes that are disrupted by lack of activity. And so that's mapped on this slide. I'm not going to read them all to you, but essentially what I want to convey to this group is that inactivity is just as pluripotent as exercise. So having a low level of activity has pluripotent consequences on virtually every organ system in some form or fashion. So here's the inactivity map. I'm not sure we've seen this today. We may have. We've seen a lot of maps. But this is the CDC map from a few years back. You can see why Wendy and I are very interested in studying this, right? Because this is where we are. And this sort of Appalachian trail sort of belt here of inactivity is a really important population to be studying and trying to understand and improve on. And I like to show this because if you click through all the chronic disease maps, they all essentially look the same, right? So there's your heart disease map. It's not quite the same, but you still see that band, right? Okay. There's your diabetes map. It's actually growing, unfortunately, but you still see the dark band where we are, and so forth. So obesity, again, it's also growing. And there's another evolutionary picture. This is actually from The Economist about 14, 15 years ago now. And I always like to tell, when I show this to students, I always tell them, and by the way, that's a Diet Coke. All right, so what about cancer? You've seen these maps. We're sort of starting to see some of the same theme. This is a really important region of the country to be studying, and this is for lung cancer, and then I think I have colorectal as well. Colorectal is a little bit more spread out. All right, so let's talk about fitness, because fitness, so we intertwine a lot of terminology, physical activity and exercise, and then fitness just sort of gets thrown in there as part of it, and we just assume if you're more active, you're more fit. That's not necessarily true. So I want to focus on cardiorespiratory fitness for just a minute. And I think this is the most compelling paper that I can share with you. Long-term change in cardiorespiratory fitness. Now we're talking VO2 max, tested on a treadmill, graded exercise testing on all-cause mortality. Okay? So this is, I can't remember the exact number of folks that are represented here, but it's a large-scale summary of data. And essentially what this says is, over a period of time, if my VO2 max drops, okay, a significant amount, and this is a big drop in VO2 max, but if your VO2 max drops just a bit, 5 ml per kg per minute, you have an increase in mortality. If it drops 10, you got a big increase. You can just sort of follow the trend, right? On the other side, though, if I just train with enough intensity and frequency to increase my VO2 max a little bit, 5 mLs per kg per minute, I get a pretty significant improvement in mortality. So this is a very powerful, and I can show a lot of studies, cross-sectional studies and so forth to show this, but this is a very powerful biomarker. I think it's beyond a biomarker. It's a very powerful indicator of all-cause mortality. We can apply this to cancer. So here you go. Cardiorespiratory fitness as a predictor of cancer mortality specifically. Same thing. This is a number of studies, a meta-analysis, so 71,000 patients, And if you essentially look at the summary, they looked at these folks in three sort of tertiles. You got those who have high cardiorespiratory fitness, those who are moderate, and those who have low. The difference, the relative risk of dying, okay, if you compare high fitness to low, it's a 45% risk reduction. That's amazing. If you compare just moderate VO2 max to low, it's a 20% risk reduction. So it's pretty powerful stuff. And I won't show you the studies, but if you look at some of the studies from the Cooper Institute years ago, mostly in middle-aged men, low fitness is a more powerful predictor of all-cause mortality, and I'm talking about VO2 max, is a more powerful predictor of all-cause mortality than is smoking, than is having type 2 diabetes, than is having hypertension. So if you go back and you look at some of those JAMA papers that came out of the Cooper Institute, pretty powerful stuff. Okay. Now, let's flip the coin. This is an interesting study. It summarizes some data, a 21-year follow-up of lifelong runners. Essentially, this is not an exercise trial. This is an observational study of people who essentially were questioned repeatedly over 21 years, and you know, the data are the data. So how rigorous are the data? We can all question that, but I think it's actually quite interesting. So over this span of time, people who reported a pretty substantial running behavior versus those who didn't, the runners offset disability 15 years. Not mortality, disability, 15 years. Okay? So the same rate of disability here occurred at this age in the sedentary folks and was pushed out 15 more years in the runners. Now, if you go to the mortality curve, this is pretty striking as well. Okay? There you go. So the deeper, thicker line are obviously the community controls, and then the Runners Club, much more shallow in terms of mortality curve. So pretty interesting in my view. This is one of my favorite cartoons. We've seen a few of these today. All right, so let's talk. I'm not going to review look ahead and some of the trials you just heard about. So actually, I'm going to zip through these quick. But I want to just give you one take-home from the studies that you've already heard about, particularly HF Action, Look Ahead, and DPP. Look Ahead and DPP were both diet and exercise treatment studies. We've already heard about that. HF Action was in heart failure patients and it was exercise only. But in all cases, the benefits were clinically meaningful, and in the case of HF Action, it has actually changed clinical practice. Okay? But in all cases, the treatment, the exercise treatment itself was relatively modest in terms of intensity. Nothing wrong with that because they had some pretty clinically important outcomes. HF Action, you can see that this quality of life score, much greater in those who exercise trained. And the nice thing about this study, in my view, is that there's this period of supervised training followed by follow-up, and it was sustained pretty well. And then I'll skip Look Ahead. You've already heard about it. Actually, one comment from Look Ahead, sorry. And that is, this gets to this concept of inter-individual response heterogeneity, which is really important, I think, when we think about precision. So in this trial, because it was large enough to start looking at groups of people, okay, this is the intensive lifestyle intervention over here, okay? But the people who benefited the most in terms of weight change as well as glucose control as measured by hemoglobin A1C, the people who benefited the most were the ones that got the greatest increases in fitness. So there's actually some people who saw a decline in cardiorespiratory fitness over the course of the study, because this is a long-term follow-up in this case. So it does matter how you respond. And so I just wanted to point that out. This is actually, you've already heard about this paper, so we'll skip that. The LIFE study, very modest treatment in mobility-impaired older adults, an 8-site trial, came out in JAMA. it's actually a modest outcome. The outcome being major mobility disability. Those who were in the physical activity treatment arm had a slightly improved risk of disability, but it was very modest, and the intervention itself was modest. So it sort of speaks to this idea that intensity matters, frequency matters, and so forth. So what are the factors that influence exercise adaptation? I've already shown you that. I'm down to 9 seconds, by the way. Prescription, in my view, is incredibly important. Now, physical activity interventions are great, but if it's an exercise trial, prescription matters, which means there's some rigor to it, and all of these components matter. And the interventions are designed based on what is the expected outcome. Do I want to activate this population of stem cells and induce hypertrophy of the hippocampus in the brain if I'm studying people with cognitive impairment? Okay, what's the frequency and intensity by which I need to do that? We sort of have titrated some of this out in muscle for older atrophied adults. We kind of know that the frequency of stimulation to their muscle has to be a little bit different than in young people to get some of the same benefit, but we haven't sorted it out in all systems and in all groups. So motor pack, some of you may be aware of this, some of you may not, but this is the future. I mean, what we've been talking about a lot today, what we need to underlie the next wave of trials are these molecular maps. So what will come out of this 6-year trial, this is a national level trial, will be the molecular transducers of both resistance training and aerobic training in muscle, blood, and adipose tissue. Okay, so this is a huge effort by the NIH Common Fund to uncover some of those molecular transducers. So every omics platform, if you're a molecular person and you're aware of metabolomics, proteomics, genomics, epigenomics, et cetera, all of those platforms will be accomplished on a group of about 3,000 people randomized to either resistance training or aerobic training. And I think that will lead us to the maps that will help us understand what's going on. We're one of the sites at UAB. All right, so really quickly in the last minute, and I know you all want to get to lunch. Regenerative medicine, we hear a lot about it as a buzzword. I would argue that exercise is regenerative medicine. Read the definition. Isn't that what we all try to do with exercise? We want to repair things, restore functions. We want to hopefully replace damaged cells and damaged organelles within cells. That's just what we do. So you can look in the literature and find evidence that there is truly regenerative properties of doing exercise training. But it does come back to being both intensity dependent and frequency dependent, and frankly, mode dependent as well. So this is a nice review, and it essentially says that when you perform some exercise and skeletal muscle is active, you activate stem cells from the bone marrow, you activate stem cells in the periphery, including skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and so forth. You activate neurogenic processes in the brain. You activate a lot of processes that we don't really think much about, lipolysis and adipose, the browning of white fat. Lots of things are happening at the molecular and cellular level that are very, very powerful. We don't understand all of it yet, but that's the exciting next steps for the field. These are some of the signaling cascades that have been uncovered. We're not going to have a quiz. But just to say, this is just the tip of the iceberg. That's what the MotorPack program is going to reveal for all of us. And the whole idea of MotorPack is to study a group of healthy adults from 18 years of age to 70 plus, to provide the control group, the biorepository, and all the data for all of your studies. So you're going to do the disease-focused studies, and your healthy controls are going to be banked. So just keep it in mind. I think it's going to be a really powerful resource for all of us. So these are just some of the things that I know that exercise does and does quite effectively, and so I would consider it very much regenerative. This last one, we need to know more, right? Some encouraging new data in animal models, though. Can we actually influence tumorigenesis? Let's look at a couple of quick studies, and then I'll stop. I'm going to skip that one. We'll just get right to the cancer one. So these are relatively new papers. And essentially what you see in this paper is if exercise is stacked onto chemo, and in this case doxorubicin, okay, it reduces the growth of tumorous tissue, in other words, cell proliferation, more so than dox alone. So that tells me it's pretty powerful potentially in that context. And this also, in the same study, exercise increases the delivery of dox to the tumor site itself. So there are probably some important things that we can learn from animal models, and we need to find out if they translate, but I think this is a good start. Another one really quickly, exercise actually reduces brain metastasis. And so this is, the idea here was, does treadmill exercise in mice actually influence cancerous cells crossing the blood-brain barrier? And in fact, it seems like it does quite well in terms of suppressing metastasis to the brain. So I just thought those two were interesting. I guess I'll probably stop. I got a couple more slides, but we're pretty much out of time. You all want to get to lunch, so.